from the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center at Stanford University.
Hello, my name is Mike Breger, Communications Manager here at Shorenstein APARC, and I'm here today talking with Dr. Gerhard Hoffstaedter, our Li Kong Chen NUS-Stanford Fellow on Southeast Asia. His research focuses on refugee experiences and placemaking, particularly in the context of Malaysia. Dr. Hoffstaedter, it's a pleasure to have you here in the office today and to be speaking with you about your research.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
First, tell me a little bit about your current research project.
Sure. So over the last 15 years, I've been working with refugees in Malaysia mostly, understanding what life is like for them in a country that doesn't legally recognize them. And so I've done the research, I've done the data collection, and I'm writing a book on this topic right now. I'm also looking at Southeast Asia studies, the current state of Southeast Asia studies, especially in the region, Southeast Asia, but also Australia, the US, and Europe. And I'm also looking at durable solutions in the region. So those are the three key solutions that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees offers refugees: integration into a host society, resettlement, or return to their country of origin if the situation has gotten better there. And I'm trying to better understand what the situation is like for refugees from Myanmar, who sometimes could go back. Now there's a civil war again in Myanmar, so they can't return. Resettlement in the region has retreated. There's not many resettlement places for people in Southeast Asia. So what does the future look like for refugees in the region more broadly?
What are some of the specific challenges that you've identified that refugees from Myanmar face in their efforts to establish a sense of place and belonging?
Yeah, thanks. So in Malaysia, as I said, Malaysia does not recognize refugees. So they are classed as undocumented, sometimes illegal, inverted commas. And the major issue is that the UNHCR has an office in Malaysia, but doesn't have the funds to actually look after them. So there are no refugee camps. Everyone is an urban refugee and has to fend for themselves. So the first thing is employment. They have to work in order to survive. Secondly, there are no schools. They're not allowed to go to the Malaysian school system. So they have to offer their own education to the students, to the children. And there are many children, about 30,000 registered with UNHCR. And health is another issue in terms of accessing the Malaysian health system is very expensive. As foreigners, they have to pay a huge premium. They do not have access to insurance. And so there are smaller health services, particularly for refugees, but it's a big issue, especially if you're trying to have a baby or if you have a major ailment that you have to go to hospital for. So there are lots of obstacles that curtail world-making or life, place-making for refugees. But I've also documented good stories or better stories where refugees have been able to, for instance, on a farm on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur, manage to till the land, create a life for themselves, produce vegetables that they can sell to their own community, but also the markets in Kuala Lumpur, and create a respite home for sick members of their community to come to and have a time out, as it were. So there are places and spaces that refugees create for themselves, sometimes with the help from locals who support them, to allow them to have a sense of and hope for a better future. For many, that is still the hope for resettlement to a safe third country, but for some, that has now turned out to be a more stable life in Malaysia.
And what does the interaction between these refugees and the UNHCR look like? You mentioned that there aren't a lot of resources, but is there any sort of interaction, and what supports do they get officially?
So the UNHCR first came to Malaysia when lots of Indo-Chinese refugees were fleeing the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and in the late 70s, early 80s. And a lot of them were coming by boat to Hong Kong, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. The Malaysians at first were not very impressed, didn't want to take them in at all. Subsequently, lots of countries came together in the Comprehensive Plan of Action, which promised to resettle everyone. And so Malaysia allowed the UNHCR in to take care of refugees. So there were refugee camps back then, to support them and ultimately to resettle everyone, because that was the deal. And I think that's still where the Malaysian government often, when they think about refugees, that's the kind of deal they have in mind, that it's somebody else's problem, somebody will resettle them. So the UNHCR has been there for over 40 years now. But initially, when they were set up with a particular mission. That mission has changed. So in the early 2000s, many refugees from Myanmar came, and the UNHCR was overwhelmed, and they instituted new ways of registering refugees, mass registration, for instance, that were pioneered in Malaysia. And that meant that the numbers grew to levels the Malaysian government was not very happy about. So currently there's about 185,000 refugees registered with the UNHCR, and that's the main point of contact, because registration is crucial. It allows refugees to access the system of status determination so that they are a bona fide refugee. They get a card that the Malaysian authorities are supposed to acknowledge and allow them free passage within Peninsular Malaysia. And it is a form of identification for many people who, either because they're stateless or because they've lost their identity papers, don't have any form of identification. So registration through the UNHCR is the key, and it's also the first step for the durable solution most refugees hope for, which is resettlement to a safe third country, because with registration one enters that system of interviews, and then subsequently the UNHCR will see how vulnerable you and your family might be, and whether where on the imaginary queue you might be placed for resettlement, very sparse resettlement places, to places like the United States, Australia, Europe, for a better future, which all refugees hope for.
Thank you. How would you say this refugee crisis compares to other refugee crises around the world?
I hear this word bandied around a lot, and I always like to challenge the notion of a crisis, because a crisis makes us think of, oh, this is new, this is unprecedented, and we hear it around climate change, we hear it around refugees or people movement, but I don't think it's a crisis in the sense of something unprecedented and something people weren't, or countries didn't know about. It is largely a crisis that is produced by policies of neighboring countries. So, for instance, in 2017, the Andaman Sea crisis, where thousands of refugees were stranded on boats in the Andaman Sea, was a crisis, yes, but it was instigated by Thailand and Malaysia, who did not allow those boats to land on their shores because of their pushback policies. So a lot of the supposed crises are actually produced by national government policies that seek to securitize rather than help. Focus on national security rather than regional security and or humanitarian impetus to help people who are suffering, who are in need of help. And so I always like to challenge the notion of crisis as something new in that sense. And I'm starting to use new terminology like permacrisis, which means it's been around for a long time, especially because of what's happening in Myanmar over and over again, especially for Rohingya, who've been persecuted through violent means and pushed out of Myanmar several times in the last, since the 50s, 1950s. So it's an ongoing crisis, so permacrisis, and also it's a polycrisis, which means there are compounding effects. So we might see something bubble up to the surface at a particular point in time, but there are lots of other factors that have influenced why people are fleeing, why they might be coming to Malaysia, what life is like for them, influenced by other policies, by other issues in individual countries, so it might be domestic policies, but also regional policies. It might be ASEAN, it might be Australia, coming in through the Bali process on human trafficking, for instance. So there are lots of moving parts that have an impact on a particular crisis that we might see.
Thanks for giving some context in the interwoven and long-term attributes of these crises, not just crises, but something more profound and pronounced. Shifting our conversation a little bit to your time here at APARC at Stanford, how has your time here at APARC as an LKC fellow aided your research?
It's been fantastic, and so I've spent 3 months at National University of Singapore. Now I'm spending 3 months here at Stanford, APARC, and principally I'm writing. But in both places, actually, I've been pulled away into the exciting intellectual, work and talks and events that are happening across campus. So it's been very fruitful to not just live within what I'm writing about, but actually be exposed to other issues, whether it's joining the anthropology department here at Stanford for talks, or going to other events on the 4 levels of this building. So not just APARC events, but other centers within the Institute. And so, just soaking up all the policy work, all the interesting people who are around, catching up with people, being exposed to different ideas and people who are coming through has been very fruitful to think with. So it will undoubtedly have an impact on what I'm writing and how I'm writing about things. But especially at APARC, big shout out to Lisa Lee, who is without whom I think as LKC fellows wouldn't get here and or couldn't function here, for organizing everything. Of course, Don Emerson as the program director, and it's lovely to be here and have those chats as we pass each other in the corridor. And then, 2 hours later, we return to our work, having gone down some rabbit hole or other, talking about something Southeast Asia related. And then Giwok Shin, the director of APARC, who also included me in his lab to talk about racism in Malaysia and in Southeast Asia. And it's been great connecting with postdocs and other fellows in the Japan program, for instance, and making new friends and learning about other people's research is always exciting.
That's wonderful. Glad to hear that it's been such a fruitful time and you've been able to extract the most out of your time here. I know that Encina Hall, with all of its multi-tiered centers, can seem somewhat daunting, but it seems like you've really plugged in. Now shifting again to the future, both for yourself and for future generations of scholars in the field, to any young anthropologists who might be listening, what advice would you give to a young scholar entering your field?
I think it's easy to say from a privileged position that I'm in, having a job these days, is to follow your passion, ultimately. I think there are often, even I at times, thought about a strategic avenue to follow in terms of research that might be more employable, which has never proven true. It was always more about find what you're passionate about, because that is ultimately what you're going to be best at, you're going to be most dedicated to, you are going to invest, in Bourdieu's sense, you're going to invest yourself most in that, and hopefully be happy doing it. There's, I think, nothing worse than doing something for strategic reasons or because you think it might be better for the job market, and then you might not enjoy doing it. If you're dedicating as an academic essentially your life, your working life to it. So something that you enjoy or are passionate about, some kind of activism that might drive you beyond a particular project or a particular idea. For me, it's always been an underlying question of how can people live together in all their diversity, in all their differing worldviews, beliefs, ideas about what's right, what's wrong. How can we live together without essentially violence or without that violence becoming the norm, I guess.
Admirable goal and sound advice for anyone in any academic field and beyond. And for you, what's on the horizon once you leave Stanford and return to your teaching post? What's next?
Well, when I get back to the University of Queensland, I'm straight into teaching, but teaching my two favorite courses, survey course of introductory course on anthropology and a migration course where I can talk about refugees. So I'm looking forward to teaching, finishing the book, and lots of new projects on the horizon that have, some of which have come together here actually, talking to Don, talking to people here, and we'll be furthering them, applying for funding and hopefully getting the funding, and then working on some of these projects, one of them being the current state of Southeast Asia studies and what we can do to make it more prominent, I guess, and certainly my work with refugees on a more regional basis, and how, again, what we can do to help refugees in the region have a better life and hopefully more protection in the future.
This has been Dr. Gerhard Hoffstaedter, and I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day and joining me here.
It's been a pleasure.